The scent is what hits me first, not the damp earth of the square, but the forge. The sharp, mineral tang of hot iron. It's the smell of the smithy, but it's wrong. It's here, in the open air. My husband Edric stands with the village elders. He looks through me as if I am a ghost already. He didn't bring a witness. He brought a suspicion, a feeling, a story he heard from a shepherd about a man seen near our field. It is enough. Under the old custom, it is more than enough. My truth is worthless. My proof must be written in my own flesh, in the language of fire. They lead me to the brazier. Father Alcuin's voice rises and falls in Latin prayer, blessing the instrument of my judgment. He prays that God will bring the truth to light. I pray for my hand not to shake. The smith lifts the iron rod. A collective inhale from the crowd. Children are lifted onto shoulders. This is not just my trial. The rod glows, a malevolent star pulled from the coals. It is placed, hissing softly, across two stones. The handle, wrapped in wet cloth, is offered, not to the priest. To me, I must be the one to take my own punishment into... My fingers close around the cloth. The heat is immense, even through the wrapping. The command comes, walk. 9 paces. The length of 3 men lying down. Each step is an eternity. The weight is not of iron, but of every eye upon me. My fate is no longer in this village. It has been passed to biology, to infection, to the silent judgment of a wound. This was the law. For centuries, across the patchwork of Europe, a husband's doubt could be transformed into a public, physical test of his wife's fidelity. It was called trial by ordeal, and it was one of the most brutally elegant weapons of social control ever devised. If you believe the true history of power is written not in books but on human skin, stay with the Black Code. Subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're witnessing this from. We are about to dissect the medieval logic that turned suspicion into spectacle and a wife's body into a legal document. Part 1: the cosmology of doubt. Why ordeal, not evidence? To understand the ordeal, we must abandon modern ideas of evidence. The medieval mind inhabited a different world. It was a world alive with divine will. God was not a distant observer, he was an active participant in daily life. A good harvest was his blessing, a plague was his wrath. And in matters of hidden truth, like a secret sin, he was the ultimate witness. The ordeal was a direct appeal to that divine witness. It was a judicium Dei, a judgment of God. Human testimony could lie. God's judgment, manifest in flesh, could not. This belief was the bedrock, but the specific application to female adultery wasn't random. It targeted the one thing a patriarchal, property-based society feared most: uncertainty of paternity. A man's legacy, his land, his title, his very bloodline, depended on the absolute fidelity of his wife. The ordeal externalized this profound private anxiety. It moved the doubt from the husband's mind to the wife's body, and from there to the entire community and to God himself. It wasn't just about punishing infidelity, it was about eradicating doubt permanently. Part 2: the ritual machinery, ordeal by hot iron in minute detail. The procedure was not a chaotic mob action, it was a tightly scripted legal and religious ritual. First, the accusation. The husband would bring his charge before the local Lord's Court or the 100 Moot. He did not need proof. His oath, his honor, was sufficient to trigger the process. The wife could counter oath, but her word carried less weight. The deadlock would be resolved by ordeal. A date was set, allowing the spiritual preparation. The accused wife was often made to fast, to pray, to confess other sins to a priest, to purify her soul for the divine encounter. On the day, a mass was held. The iron, its weight often prescribed by law, sometimes 1 pound, sometimes 3, was blessed. The priest would invoke God to show the truth. Then came the heating. The iron was placed in a fire until it was, as one law code states, hot enough to light straw. It was laid on stones. The accused, often barefoot and in a simple shift, would approach. Here's a chilling detail from some accounts. Sometimes a handful of barley grains was thrown onto the iron. If they ignited, the iron was deemed sufficiently hot. The visual of popping burning seeds added to the theatre. She would grasp the handle, walk the prescribed distance, and drop the iron. Immediately, attendants would wrap her hand in a clean linen cloth, seal it with wax, and often mark it with the priest's seal. This seal was crucial. It prevented tampering during the 3-day wait. Part 3, the waiting, 3 days in purgatory. The physical ordeal lasted minutes. The psychological ordeal lasted 3 days. The accused would be kept under watch, often in a church or a designated house. The pain would set in. A burn from a hot iron isn't just surface pain, it cooks the tissue. The throbbing would be relentless. Fever might follow. She would know that beneath that sealed cloth, her body was deciding her fate. Was it healing cleanly? In a world with no antibiotics, with bandages rarely changed, what did clean even mean? The definition was fluid, and it rested entirely with the priest who would inspect it. On the 3rd day, the community reassembled. The seal was broken, the cloth unwrapped. The priest would examine the wound, sometimes probing it. Pus, redness, swelling, corruption. These meant guilt. A wound that was dry, scabbed, or showed laudable pus, a thin, clear fluid, could be interpreted as innocence. The judgment was absolute. If guilty, the punishments varied by region and status. Part 4, the price of guilt, from shame to the stake. For a noblewoman, guilt might mean being shut away in a nunnery for life, a living death, but one that preserved family honor. Her dowry would be forfeit to her husband. Her children's legitimacy could be questioned. For a peasant woman, the consequences were more physically dire. She could be publicly scourged. Have her nose or ears cut off, a common punishment for adultery, or be driven from the village. In some jurisdictions, particularly where biblical law held sway, the punishment was death. Death by stoning, or more commonly in later medieval periods, death by burning. The fire that tested her would consume her. The symbolism was hideously perfect. If found innocent, she was theoretically restored, but could a marriage survive that public ritual of doubt? Her hand would bear a scar for life, a permanent, public testament that her husband had once demanded God judge her. The social stain, the whispers, would linger. The ordeal didn't just test guilt, it created permanent damage. Part 5, the elemental spectrum, water, bread, and combat. Fire was the preferred method for women accused of adultery, but the legal imagination had other tools. The ordeal of cold water was based on the principle that water, as a pure element, would reject the guilty. The accused would be bound, right thumb to left thumb to right toe, and lowered into a pond or stream. If she sank, was accepted by the water, she was innocent. If she floated, was rejected, she was guilty. It was a test rigged by simple physics. A terrified person, bound tightly, might trap air in their clothes and float. The innocent outcome required being hauled out before drowning, a timing left to the discretion of the operators. Then there was the ordeal of boiling water, often for poisoning or witchcraft alongside adultery. The accused would retrieve a stone or ring from a boiling cauldron, sometimes up to the elbow. The scolding was horrific. The bandaging and 3-day wait followed the same cruel pattern. For the high nobility, there was the ordeal of the blessed morsel or korsned. A piece of bread or cheese was consecrated with a prayer that it would choke the guilty. The accused would eat it. If they choked, coughed, or showed difficulty swallowing, guilt was proven. The power of suggestion, the dry mouth of sheer terror, made this a potent psychological weapon. And for men there was trial by combat. The husband could fight the alleged lover or a champion. Victory proved the accusation true. This placed the resolution firmly in the male martial sphere. For women, the ordeal was almost always passive, a receiving of judgment through their body. Part C, the legal patchwork, from Salic law to canon law. This practice didn't spring from nowhere. Its roots were in ancient Germanic customary law. The Salic law of the Franks, 5th–6th century, mentions ordeals. The Lombardic codes in Italy detailed them. Initially, they were a way to settle disputes where neither side had reliable witnesses, a substitute for feud. The Church was initially wary, seeing it as a pagan holdover, but by the 8th and 9th centuries, it performed a stunning co-option. It Christianized the ritual. Priests would bless the elements, say masses, and interpret the outcome as God's will. In doing so, the Church gained immense social control. It positioned itself as the indispensable intermediary between humanity and God's judgment. This fusion of secular law and sacred ritual made the ordeal nearly unassailable. To challenge it was to challenge both the local Lord's justice and God's omnipotence. Part 7, the husband's ultimate weapon, power without proof. Let's be clear, this was a profoundly asymmetrical law. A wife had almost no equivalent recourse. If she accused her husband of infidelity, she faced an uphill battle of shame and legal obstruction. Male adultery was often seen as a minor trespass, not a threat to the social order. The ordeal for wives was, in practice, a tool of terror and a release valve for male insecurity. It could be used cynically. A husband tired of his wife, wanting her dowry or to marry another, could use an ordeal accusation to be rid of her. The risk to him was minimal. He might lose face if she was proven innocent, but he wouldn't lose his hand, his freedom, or his life. The public spectacle also served him. It restored his honor publicly, whether he won or lost. If she was guilty, he was a wronged man, righteously vindicated. If she was innocent, he was a dutiful Christian who had submitted his doubts to God and accepted his holy judgment. Part 8, whispers of dissent, the critics within. Was there opposition? Yes, but it was a minority voice, often from intellectuals within the Church itself. Bishop Agobard of Lyon, in the 9th century, wrote scathingly that ordeals were a vain superstition and a tempting of God. He argued that divine mercy might spare a guilty person, confusing the result. Pope Stephen V in the late 9th century also expressed doubts, but these were cracks in an imposing edifice. The practice was too useful, too embedded in the social fabric. It provided clear, final answers in a murky world. More common than outright condemnation was an attempt to regulate and control it. Church councils decreed that priests must oversee the rituals, trying to prevent outright mob lynching. In doing so, they further legitimized it. The Church became the guardian of the very practice it sometimes questioned. Part 9, the anatomy of a spectacle, communal psychology. We must not underestimate the ordeal as public theatre. It was a civic event, a morality play with real blood. The entire community, men, women, children, was compelled to watch. Why? First, deterrence. Every woman watching would internalize the lesson. Your fidelity will be policed by fire. Second, catharsis. The community's latent anxieties about disorder, sin, and female sexuality were given a focal point. They could project their fears onto the accused and witness them being literally burned away. Third, reinforcement of hierarchy. It showed the power of the Lord's court, the authority of the priest, and the ultimate sovereignty of the husband over his wife. It was a ritual of social cohesion through brutality. The accused woman was made a scapegoat. Her body became the text upon which the community's laws and fears were written. Part X, Case Shadows, The Names We Don't Know. Hard evidence of specific cases is rare. These were local events, rarely recorded in chronicles that favoured kings and bishops. But fragments survive. In the Domesday Book of 11th century England, a woman named Odelina is mentioned as having cleared herself of a charge by the ordeal of hot iron. We know nothing else about her. Legal codes are more telling. The 10th century English law code of King Athelstan prescribes the ordeal for a woman accused of adultery if her husband wishes it. The laws of the Alemanni and Bavarians specifically detail the process for the hot iron ordeal for wives. Sometimes the records are chillingly bureaucratic. A church register might note a grant of divorce because the woman failed in the ordeal, or a payment to the priest for conducting the judgment. These dry entries are the ghostly paper trails of countless personal catastrophes. Part Iti, The Turning Point, the Fourth Lateran Council, 1215. The beginning of the end arrived from the very institution that had sanctified the practice, the Church. Pope Innocent III, one of the most powerful popes in history, convened the Fourth Lateran Council. Among its many decrees, Canon 18 was a quiet earthquake. It forbade clergy from participating in ordeals. No more blessings of iron or water, no more masses beforehand, no more priests interpreting wounds. The reasons were complex: a growing sense that it was unseemly, the rise of Roman law with its focus on evidence, and perhaps a theological shift away from demanding visible miracles from God. Without the Church's ritual framework, the ordeal lost its divine legitimacy. It was stripped back to its core: state-sanctioned torture. Secular rulers, particularly in England and France, began phasing it out, replacing it with jury trials, where a panel of men would decide a woman's guilt or innocence instead of God. The change was slow, taking most of the 13th century, but the tide had turned. Part 2, The Aftermath, the ordeal's long shadow. The legal mechanism faded, but the mindset it cultivated did not. The suspicion of women, the belief that their bodies held secrets that needed extracting, morphed into new forms. The witch trials of the early modern period used pricking and swimming tests, direct descendants of the ordeal. The swimming test for witches was the ordeal of cold water reborn. If you floated, rejected by the pure water, you were guilty of consorting with the devil. Thousands of women died by this logic. The focus on female sexuality as a dangerous, polluting force that required violent control persisted for centuries. Even in courts, the character of a woman accusing a man of rape was, and in some places still is, put through a kind of social ordeal, scrutinized, doubted, and judged in the court of public opinion. The legacy is one of institutionalized distrust. The ordeal formalized the idea that a woman's word about her own body was inherently suspect and that her innocence required a painful public performance. Part 3, The Silent Scar, a Personal Aftermath. Let us return to our woman in the square. Let's assume, against the odds, that her wound was deemed clean. She is proclaimed innocent. The crowd disperses. Her husband must take her back. But what is her life now? Every time she uses that hand, the shiny, tight scar will catch the light. It will ache in the cold. Her children will ask about it. Villagers will glance at it and remember. She lives with a husband who believed her capable of betrayal and who chose the most drastic possible way to prove it. The trust is gone, replaced by a scar and a memory of smoke. Her innocence is forever tinged with the mark of punishment. This may be the ordeal's most insidious effect. It poisoned the well of marriage, even in success. Part 40, Modern Echoes, the Fire That Never Went Out. We like to think such barbarism is locked in the distant past, but the core dynamics are hauntingly familiar. The demand for women to prove their respectability, their fidelity, or their truthfulness in ways men are not. The public shaming of women for sexual behavior on social media, a digital village square. The persistence of honor-based violence in some cultures, where a family's honor is tied to a woman's purity, and doubt can be resolved with extreme violence. The ordeal is gone. But the desire to control female sexuality, to use women's bodies as canvases for social anxiety, has proven incredibly adaptable. We've traded hot irons for hashtags, but the burning scrutiny remains. Part 15. A final judgment. What the ordeal really was. The trial by ordeal for wives was not a flawed attempt at justice. It was something else entirely. It was a performative enforcement of patriarchal power, a religiously sanctioned terror tactic, a piece of social theatre designed to keep an entire gender in check by making the consequences of doubt visceral, public, and horrifying. It wrapped control in the cloak of divinity. It shows us that the most effective laws are not always about fairness. Sometimes they are about fear. And they write their decrees not on parchment, but directly onto the human body in a language of fire and scar tissue. If you believe that understanding these dark mechanisms is the first step to ensuring they remain history, then subscribe to the Black Code. Our archive is a chronicle of the shadows we've left behind and those we still cast. Let me know in the comments, what part of this historical reality did you find most disturbing? The detailed ritual, the psychological torment, or its unsettling modern echoes? Until our next exploration of history's grim chapters, remember, some laws are so powerful they don't need to be written down, they need only to be believed. And for centuries across Europe, one such law was this: a wife's innocence was not a right, but a trial.